As he gives me the countdown, we'll be able to get it on, get it, get it in. Tonight we have a very special guest. Professor Erica Baffelli will be joining us. It's time to get Uncanny. Welcome, everybody, to a very special episode of This Uncanny Earth. Today, we have a very special guest. She is a professor. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Professor Erica Baffelli. Hello, Professor Baffelli. How are you doing today?
Hello, very well, thank you. It's late afternoon, early evening in Manchester, so we're fine. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're very welcome. And that's Manchester, England, correct?
Yes, it is.
See, guys, all the way on the other side of the ocean. We're getting guests from on the other side of the ocean. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is you do.
So I am professor of Japanese studies at the University of Manchester, and my background is both in Japanese studies and religious studies, and I mainly work on contemporary Japanese religions, mainly on group that's been established from the 19th century, so really new ones. So I've been working on topics like media and new religion, gender, violence, and more recently I've been working on emotion and temporalities and religious minorities.
Excellent, excellent. I myself have been studying Japan since I was a youngster. Actually, I grew up on the old Zatoichi and 47 Ronin and Harakiri movies. As a kid, I used to watch all that stuff, and then I started learning more about Japan as time went on, and my favorite period being the Edo period and that whole ideology behind it. Because what we see with Japan is a strong sense of honor that a lot of other countries don't, I don't want to necessarily have, but it's a very strict honor code in Japan that still exists to this day.
Yeah, it's also been a lot codified, I would say, in the narratives and the representation of Japan. I think a lot of think about Japan, we only need to distinguish what has been put forward as image of Japan brought from outside or inside, and what is actually going on in the society, which is always something that I'm quite interested in my research as well.
And I would have to agree, because Japan is unlike any other country in the world in its population is mostly homogenous. And there wasn't really a big foreign influence for a very, very long time in Japan in its past. And now we even see that there are still some kind of tight regulations against foreigners in Japan. So that shows you that the history of Japan has still pretty much stayed very much on track from where it began. And as a person, like I said, who studied Japan for such a long time, the societal ideologies that Japan has as compared to, say, the United States, where I live, are vastly different. And there is a big culture shock, even in language, even in writing in kanji, hiragana, or katakana is much different than writing in English. And so it just really fascinates me, and it's always fascinated me to that extent. Erica, what was your what was the point for you where you said, I want to learn about Japan? What was it for you, that sort of aha moment where you're like, this is what I want to do?
I didn't go. I didn't went to Japanese studies through popular culture, which was very common amongst my classmates at university. A lot of them were really into manga and anime. I wasn't. For me, it was I must confess, quite a random choice. I wanted to study something different. I was interested in philosophy and other ideas, and Venice University, where I study, had a very good program on Japanese and also East Asian studies, and I picked Japanese. But from the very beginning, I was really interested in contemporary Japan. And what you were talking about is ideology of homogeneity, because in the reality is an ideology. Japan is much less homogeneous than is portrayed to be. There always been minorities. There are strong differences between different areas of Japan, and of course we have minority that has been colonized inside Japan as well. So that idea why they project a kind of a state ideology or has been so strong was one of the things that I was interested in. And then more and more I got more interested about religious aspects, and in particular religion and society. Especially because in Japan people are not particularly interested in religion, and I wanted to figure it out why.
Now, Japan at its beginning was Shintoism, a sort of almost similar to Native American nature deities. We have different tales of like the Capo and the Jizo statues and things like that in Japanese literature and folk tales. And we have things like that here with Native Americans and their different mythologies and sky beings. And then you have Buddhism, which sort of took hold really of most Asian countries, and still is in most Asian countries. What do you think it is about Japan that, and I don't want to say less religious in a sense, but maybe not on the same spectrum as, say, the United States, or maybe a country that is, like Iran or Iraq, where United States it's Christianity, but in those other countries it's Islam. What do you think it is about Japan where it isn't the main focus? I would say would be the best way I could put that.
I think there is of course more complex explanation, and we can go track it back historically. But I think one of the key elements, which I always discuss also with my students, is how you define religion and how you define religious activities. So Japan, usually we one example that I usually use is when I first visited Japan, I went with a group of Japanese friends to Osaka for New Year's Eve. And we were chatting, and they asked me why I wanted to study religion, because nobody was interested in religion in Japan. And then the following morning, all of them on the 1st of January went to the temple, to the jinja, to the Shinto shrine, to pray for the new year. And I was raised in Italy, where if you say that you are not religious, it means that you don't go to church. You might go for a funeral, but usually you don't go. While I immediately realized that for them was something different. And I think one of the differences is sometimes people say that they are non-religious. They mean that they don't identify with a specific religion organization. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't practice rituals. So, for example, the visit to the temple in the beginning of the year is still very common. Buddhist funeral are declining a bit, but they are still quite common in Japan, and ancestor ritual. So sometimes I think we just look in the different direction. So we need to distinguish between the institutional religion or the religion organization and what the people do and the practice. So I think that if we look at Japan with, category that came from Protestant Christianity, of course, things looks a bit different, but this is probably a problem of our categories more than what's really happened. This is one discussion. The other important point is, I think, one of the topics we wanted to discuss tonight, that in 1995 there was this major accident in Japan, the sarin gas attack that was perpetrated by a religious organization, and that was a big shock. That impacted quite significantly on the image of religion. Even before that, it was seen as something outdated and a bit stale, but after 1995, there was also these images that religion can be actually something dangerous, can kill. So that 1995 was, in a sense, a turning point on that as well.
So with that, we discussed on a previous show cults and their ideologies, their influences, and the sarin gas attack was perpetrated by the Aum Shinrikyo and its leader Shoko Asahara. Yeah. And I have to wonder, and I wondered this because there was so when I was in university, this was roughly about 20 years ago, and I was reading through, I had just happened to go through the library, and I saw a book it was about cults, or it had like the name on the front of it. And I remember pulling it, and I read that book cover to cover in a matter of a day, maybe 2 days. And the thing with me was I was fascinated that one person, here is this blind man that was a masseuse, as we have seen in movies like Zatoichi, The Blind Swordsman, where he is also a masseuse. And here is this guy, and he is able to woo so many people. And we look at charismatic personalities, and this man had it. Maybe not to the sense of a Jim Jones or a David Koresh, but in his own way that fit. How do you think somebody like Shoko Asahara was able to gain that kind of power? I want to say power over people in Japan with such a loyal system in place. You know what I mean? Like, in a way, it would seem like, here we have Scientology, and we have things like that, and people say, if you join that, that's gonna, it's gonna be a problem, and they'll try to help you. But a lot of times in Japan, from different, we all remember in I believe it was the 80s, that a lot of high school kids were taking their lives due to bad grades. Now, I'm not going to say like an overabundance, but where do you think this man got his power in regard to the societal image of that loyalty and sort of respect?
So let's start, so I'm first of all, I tend not to use the word cult. Okay. Not necessarily, and I know that is very widely used. For one of the reasons is because it immediately creates this distinction between good and bad religion that is not necessarily useful. So if we want to understand why certain group ended up committed atrocities and very violent action, I think creating a specific type of criteria that some group can be bad or good doesn't really help. Historically, we have a lot of groups that were millenarian, for example, or talking about the end of the world, that never commit any act of violence. So I think we need to be critical, but also be careful about not immediately creating these potential negative nuances. And then the other thing you're referring to, the charismatic relationship, and the importance of the leader in some organization. And I think that is also one of the key points is the charismatic leadership is a relationship. Of course, there is the idea of charisma as a gift, but the gift needs to be recognized. So in any case, you have the leader, but you need also the followers, because if you don't have the followers, the leader simply, can say whatever they want, but they might be considered, bit kind of unusual people and maybe sent somewhere. So when we draw the line between someone who can be seen as unstable and someone that became a leader, not necessarily just in religious context. If we think of politics, we might have several examples of this kind. But what is important is the relationship. And because it's a relationship that is based on personal qualities, so it's not on a relationship that is based on law, on regulation, is by definition unstable. So this relationship needs to be maintained. And there are different examples in many religion organizations or other type of organization where the leadership is put into question. And then the group fall apart or there are issues. So this kind of relationship is always quite more unstable than when the religion, let's say, became more institutionalized, where you have a church and different institutions. And this is where, so it's the reason why we in new religious movement study, a lot of the study are done on the beginning of this organization, because it's where all this transformation happened. And Asahara, I think that, he was born from a very poor family. He moved to Tokyo and attempted to enter at the very prestigious Tokyo University and failed, and then open a Chinese medicine business that failed as well. So he had this history of failure in his career, and then he started practicing yoga and started to be recognized as a teacher. So I think that the beginning, that the group, the members that started following him, and I met some of them, really recognize him as a yoga teacher, recognize him for his quality. And for his seriousness. And why people join this group is a question that is one of the main questions in our study as well, and it's very complex because there is not one answer. There are very different reasons, but one is then these people at that time, in that moment, answer something, or they find a practice that interests them, or they were looking for something and this person had an answer for them, or they find the practice of what was offered particularly interested. So there are very different explanations. And just the final thing, one thing that I think important to remember with Aum, and despite media, of course, after the sarin gas attack, a lot of attention was on Aum and on the members, and how was this possible that young people in Japan joined this group. But if you look at the numbers, it wasn't a big group. At the time of the sarin gas attack, we only had around 1,000 people living in commune, and roughly the scholars talk about 10,000 members. And we have new religions in Japan, other religious groups that talk about millions of members. So in that sense, Aum stayed as a very small group, which was wasn't a problem. So they were very frustrated that they were not attractive more people. But in reality, it stayed very small. It never expanded. And one of the reasons was because the requirement they had was very demanding comparing to other groups.
So when we talk of Asahara and we talk of I think there's always a point. There's always a sort of tipping point. We had it with Jim Jones and the People's Temple, where at first he was very charismatic, people loved him, and he was followed. We kind of have the same with the Heaven's Gate, and I've seen some of the videos. You can go on YouTube and watch the videos of the members basically saying, we're okay with this. And they all have the same haircuts, and they all pretty much have a certain type of name, and this, that, and the other. And I want to address something that you said about people joining. I think a lot of the times we see there isn't always a clear cut case of why they join. Like you said, you can't really pinpoint it. You can chalk up maybe 70% of people that feel they're outcasts, or maybe they're lonely, or they don't have anybody. But then the other 30%, there was a young man on there. He was in the Marines.
Yeah.
He was 19. And to see that, I thought to myself, I remember when I was 19. And at 19, I don't know about you, but myself, I wasn't the smartest individual at 19. I was I was a young man. I was still trying to figure out the world, and I thought to myself, I remember when I was 19. And I think a lot of the time when you have those younger folks like you did, and it's almost like they're searching for a purpose. They're trying to figure out life in a way that most people would say, no, that's not, that doesn't make any sense, or those individuals don't know what they're doing. And just seemed like it fit for for certain people. And I don't mean certain people like they had a criteria, but it just seemed like here's this guy, like you said, whose failures he turned into a success,
Yeah.
and he basically brought these people in, and they
Yeah.
treated it. Go ahead.
So
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I agree. I think that is also one of the reasons why I don't think the word cult is necessarily useful, because a lot of these people are absolutely, standard, how we want to define it. So they are not certain, typical or similar, are very different and all with different background. And some of them, sometime when you're very young, you want black and white. You want something, you're looking for a purpose, but sometimes when it's come also to politics or other things, you want something very clear. And this was a very clear demanding path that was offered to them. There was other people that simply really enjoyed the ascetic practice. I made some interview with people say, it's difficult to say openly, but we really like it. We found it empowered by that. There was other people who were later on their life that they say, gave me a place, gave me a role, gave me something. So there is always this, very different experience of people that, and then we only forgot that in a lot of this group, there are people go in and out. So there are also people that goes for a bit and then leave. They not necessarily stay on. And this is also what make the differences and what make these people. Some people just try and say, well, no, that's not for me. And other got really into it. And in case of Aum, some of them went up living in commune, so they drop everything. That is another different point. And one thing you mentioned, which I think is very important, is how I don't think that people join organization to go and commit violence. And Aum at the beginning was a yoga group.
Yes.
It was focused on the energy of the Kundalini and on saving the world. They were presenting themselves as, we lead the world to salvation and cleanse the polluted karma. And so that was the idea with the idea beginning. And a lot of them talk of Azahara as extremely caring leader. Very caring, looking after, especially at the beginning when they were very small groups, so he knew all of them, looking after the members, but also very strict, because he was, strict on giving them the ascetic practice to complete. So this kind of balance between authority, but also pastoral care, which I think is another aspect that is important in this kind of relationship. That you feel that the leader is looking after you, is paying attention to you, etc.
And I have to agree in that a lot of times that's what people look for is a family. They're looking for that sustenance, that thing in their life that they didn't have. And a lot of time it's acceptance. And matter of fact, in all the cases, it's just being accepted. And they look at themselves as outcasts, and society kind of treats them like that. And especially in the United States, I can't speak for any other nation in terms of being in a society. I can only speak for the United States in that I am in the society, and the daily just grind of life here in the States. I can see why here comes somebody who has these charismatic leanings and ideologies, and they join like Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who was the leader of the People's Universal Church of the Triumphant, and she was this enigmatic figure. And while, like you said, and I think in this instance, she wasn't so much. It wasn't really a cult. It was an organization. They did a little bit of end time stuff where they stockpiled ammunition, but that was really about the gist of it. And they kind of separated themselves from society, because a lot of times in these groups, they separate, like you said, with the communes, they separate themselves from society, and they have a person who looks over them and says, well, you know what? I'll take care of you. And maybe they didn't have that before. The interesting thing I noticed about, as opposed to, say, the Elizabeth Clare Prophet Church or the People's Temple, is that Shoko Asahara wasn't this boisterous, loud individual, which is kind of different from, say, Elizabeth Clare Prophet was very much like, Saint Germain, and he was Jesus Christ, and it was very, very big claims that she would put out. And of course, the Reverend Jim Jones was all about being very just vocal, a very loud person, accepting but being loud about it. And the things that I've seen about Shoko Asahara is he was very reserved. When you looked at him, he was a very reserved person, and he almost looked kind. And I'm not saying he was or he wasn't, because I never met the man, but he had a kind face, and I think a lot of people gravitated to that because they saw, oh, here's almost like a father figure, if you will.
For some of them, probably some joined with their family. Some I interview member who join with their parents, and for some. But the fact that when you joined in, then especially if the experience between the member in commune and the ones that were lay member is really, really different, because the lay member basically continue their ordinary life and then they join in for some activities. While the commune member, they left everything. They drop out of school, left their job, sometimes left their spouse, left their belongings. So they were renouncing. So they renounced to everything. So the commitment was really, the stake was really high. And the problem is that when you do that, after a while, that of course became your family. You don't really have a place to go anymore. You don't, and those are also family because they share your experience. And this is something I've seen a lot in former members. Even if they are dissociated now with the organization and very critical of it, they still feel that they have this connection with other former members because they share this extremely intense and unusual experience. There is also another point that is something you were also mentioning about living in this community and be very look after. That one member I told you once, they mentioned it was a very irresponsible life in the sense that you didn't have responsibility. You didn't have a spouse to look after. You didn't have to find a job or graduate, but you were just living in commune, sharing everything. They were working. They were sent to different facilities, a shop that the Aum used to run, but it was all inside the organization. It was, in a sense, much easier than having to find a new apartment, rent it out, finding a job, marry someone, dealing with children and wedding. So it was quite telling for me when this member mentioned, yeah, there was no responsibility. And sometimes I think it's an aspect we don't look at it that much on those communities. We tend to look at the negative aspect that were there, that the kind of controlling environment that it became, not just from the leader, but each other, looking at each other, and competitive environment that those places tend to become. But there are also this other aspect that is, I think, why the people stayed is because at the end they found a place, they found a family, they found something that they enjoyed, which is sometimes difficult for them too to talk about the fact that they enjoyed it, considering the violence, what's happened afterwards.
And that takes us to the act itself, the sarin gas attacks that happened. Now, for those of the folks listening that don't know,
Yeah.
what was the catalyst that caused Shoko Asahara to say, you know what, we got to do this. You got to take these sarin, the bags, wrap them in newspaper, and then you're going to get on the subway. You're going to poke it with your umbrella, metal tipped, and then it'll go from there. What do you think it was? And I say this, the turning point, if you will, to where it was like, okay, with the People's Temple, it was them moving down to Guyana, or Jonestown to do sort of like a more of a hold, I guess would be the appropriate way to say it. What do you think was that turning point where Asahara said, you know what, this has to be done?
In the case of the sarin gas attack was the escalation because the violence has already started years before. The killing, the killing of a lawyer and his family that they were putting together a case against Aum a few years in advance. They already did another sarin gas in Matsumoto the year before. So this was just a continuously escalating of violence. There's been a lot of speculation about why they did it in March 1995. And one of the reasons was, that one of the questions that was asked is, in reality, the sarin gas attack the sarin gas that they used was not really well done. It was made in one of the own facility, but it wasn't, luckily so, because it could have killed many more people at that time. It was early morning, rush hour time in the center of Tokyo. So it would have been much more disastrous attack. So why rush it? We are mainly speculation, because one of the points that I also want to make is Asahara, who was arrested a few months after the sarin gas attack, never gave any explanation. He refused to talk. So we don't know his version. The version from the members are, of course, contradictory, accusing each other, etc. One of the speculation is that the police was finally getting at them. The police was building a case, and they were finally very close to, get them. And so they rushed it through. So the idea was that why they did it, it was the center of Tokyo. There was this building, increasing paranoia about the government, and of course conspiracy theory about the government wanting to gather them, etc. So there was a kind of total war idea against the government, etc. But it was also at the same time, and I found it very difficult to believe that they thought they could get away with it. Because it was
Right.
the case was already built in, so there is still this question mark, and say, was this a way to have this kind of way out? That was, of course you will enter in history book if you do something like that, even if you know that this means the end of your organization. So there is also this kind of, maybe that was one of the other reasons why they did it. In terms of more doctrinally, if you probably know, or some of the listeners might not know, in January of the same year, there was a very big earthquake in Japan. That in the Kobe area, the Hanshin earthquake was one of the major earthquake in post-war Japan, and Aum interpreted as one of the the realization, the coming of one of the prophecy leading into the end of the world. So this idea that in their apocalyptic vision that the end of the world will getting to be accelerated, and then the elite of people will rebuild the new world. So doctrinally, they use the Hanshin, the earthquake in Kobe, as a way to prove that the world was actually coming to an end. You need to remember it was 1995, so it was the period where, this idea of 1999, the end of
Yes.
when it was that period that they were circulated. But it was also clear already from a lot of groups in Japan or other places that was not going to happen. But Aum was in a sense trapped in their own prophecies. And I also believe, and not just me, other scholars, that Asahara's mental state was deteriorating, as progressively deteriorating over the year.
And I think too we see a lot of that in these enigmatic figures where they're either they gain too much power. So like, Jim Jones, he was crazy, so to speak. With Elizabeth Clare Prophet, she was into some very different ideas and concepts. And so for her, it was another doomsday scenario. What do you think it is about groups like and the Church Universal and Triumphant and other groups like that really focus on the end times? And do you think that the Japanese idea of death plays a key role in that sort of doomsday ideology for the not for any other group, obviously, but for
Well, at that time, Aum was not the only one that was talking about end of the millennium prophecies in Japan, amongst other new religions. There was a moment where 3 new religions, including Aum, was publishing books about Nostradamus prophecies, for example. And of course, all the leaders claiming that they were the savior from the East. The difference was that while the other group were able, the more we were closer to 1999, to change their message in a more optimistic view, became more and more apocalyptic, because you had this combination of this idea of Buddhist hell and polluted karma combined with more and more really apocalyptic view. And this idea of Asahara presenting himself as the savior, presenting himself as Jesus at one point, etc., the Messiah, etc. So I think that Aum at one point was more and more unable, doctrinally as well, to get out. And at the same time, they, as you probably have read, at one point when the first killing and that started to happen, they had to find a doctrinal justification of the killing of that, and they use a Buddhist concept for that. So this kind of so it was a combination, I think, of apocalyptic view, doctrinal aspect, and structural organizational thing. They went more and more. But there was, of course, the idea of reincarnation or achieving this kind of going beyond life and death was a very strong concept in Aum. Although Aum didn't refer that much to Japanese Buddhist tradition, their main reference was Tibetan Buddhism in their own interpretation of some of the doctrine, but they were looking mainly at that Buddhist tradition more than at the Japanese one.
Right. We have the notion of Jikoku, which is basically hell. And we have and I think also we have the sort of warrior mentality where it's almost based on an honor system. If you do this, then you'll get this reward. And Buddhism is really big into karmic aspects, of, you do good things happen to you. It's also prominent in Zoroastrianism. And most other religions, maybe save for Christianity, which speaks of salvation and not the works so much as being saved in the salvation. You should live like Christ, and the works will manifest themselves. So the whole ideology of Japan as a whole, How do you think that plays into like, you know, the social aspect? You know, people in Japan, how do you think played to the strengths of Japanese society, where I think personally here in the States, an organization like might not be as popular, because our, you know, America is a different place, you know, sociological wise, and also different in many aspects from Japan. So what do you think, um, is it about that was so successful in Japan?
Um, it wasn't so successful. That I reiterate that it was much less successful than I wanted, and that is an important point. But it's also important that to remember that, of course, any religion group organization are the product of the context, historical, social context they are developing from. And despite in a sense, proposed it to something that was in contrast with the mainstream Japanese society. We are talking about the 80s, the period of the bubble economy, hyper consumerism, and they were proposing a very demanding path in which you have to leave everything and just devoted itself to a very simple life that were mainly crazy austerities, you know, that, you know, meditation and this kind of practice that will lead you to purify your body. So this idea of polluted karma, or, you know, cutting all in the material attachment was what they proposed. But at the same time, of course, they mirrored a lot of things of the society. One of the things that was really clear in well, it was a very hierarchical, so in a sense, mirroring some of the situation of the environment. These people say they wanted to leave, and then they were in another environment that was still highly hierarchical. But there is also another important point that is key in is that in the ascetic practice, there were this kind of bodily practice that became more and more extreme, was a way to go up in the hierarchy. It was not age, it was not gender, it was not your background, but it was how good you were of doing this kind of spiritual practices. And the more you went up, the more you gain authority and power. And this is something, if we're talking an example from the States that you see in Scientology. So that, you know, the higher you go, the more you attain authority and power, and, you know, the different level that you can go up. In the case of it was also spiritual authority. You will get a holy name, etc. So the spiritual practices are key to go up in the hierarchy. They were not based on gender and or age, and that is different from, if say, the wider Japanese society at the time. So I think there is point of connection and point of course, differences. In a sense, it produced something that was in contrast to what was going on in Japan at the time, but in the same time, you can see connection or similarities, etc. between the two. And I not really, I know, expanded a bit overseas. They had, they didn't really recruit that well in New York. They had an office in New York, but they had some recruitment in Russia, for example. They had a group of members. There too, it was the number, I think, were overestimated, the one reported, so they were much less than what the media reported. But I'm not completely sure this group wouldn't work somewhere else. It's always depend, of course, on situation. But I agree that it cannot be studied in a vacuum. It needs to be studied in the context of the 80s and 90s Japanese society.
Right. Because obviously Japanese society has changed since the 80s, just like American society has changed from the 80s and 90s. A lot of our organizations changed with them. And even actually changed and became a new organization even after Asahara was executed and some of the fathers were executed. They became, if I'm not mistaken, Alf. Is that the way to pronounce it?
There are two of them. One is called Aleph, which is basically the new name that Aum took in 1999, 2000, because Aum was declared bankrupt and they lost their name, but they were still allowed to practice. They cannot be registered as a religious organization anymore, but they are allowed to practice. They are under a very strict control law. So new law were introduced after the sarin gas attack. So every 3 months they have to submit their entire membership, their list of belonging, etc. And the police search their center, their facilities quite often. And that was supposed to only last for 3 years, but it's been renewed since then, so it's still in place. And then in 2007, a splinter group came out of Aleph that is called Hikari no Wa. And the leader, it was the spokesperson of Aum, was one of the top members of Aum. And he is not the, well, officially not the leader, but basically representative of Hikari no Wa. So the two groups still exist. Hikari no Wa is extremely small. Aleph is really difficult to determine, but it didn't grow particularly. A lot of former members of Aum, and they dropped, of course, they dropped the most dangerous teaching, but also most of the extreme ascetic practice. And I always say they not just changed it, but they also aged. And I think when you start being close to late 50s and 60s, it's a bit more difficult to be in meditation for hours outside in the cold than when you are in your 20s. So I think there is that.
I think too, we don't think the same as we did when we were 20. At least I don't. I can speak for myself, but our minds change, our thoughts change, our patterns change. And maybe some of them look at it like, wow, that was a time in my life. Yeah. And I think too, and earlier we discussed successful, I meant in terms of Japan itself, because you don't hear a lot of groups like that coming out of Japan, and to reach a worldwide, like you said earlier, that was a way to cement their legacy in history. There could very well be other groups, but I've never delved into it. I know of from a random book. They were popular enough to have this random book that I found, and what really did it for me, and like you said, you can't really put in 2022 even anywhere in the world, because it's a different time. Social media, I think, is very impactful.
Yeah.
So I think we have that, but I also think too with I think that maybe at the beginning, like you said, and a lot of times with a lot of groups, the beginning is where everybody's accepted. You don't start to see the roots of the organization until sometimes it's almost too late. It's almost late to see the roots. And by then, you're like, whoa, what's going on? Yeah. And I think that, and I couldn't say this for sure. I don't know if Japan could, if another group like might emerge, and there might be one, and as we speak, but it seems to me like a lot of these organizations and these groups aren't gaining the traction that they used to. And I have to wonder if that maybe is the internet, if that is social media, influencing people being able to say, we know about this group, here's this. Do you think personally that could survive in this day and age, in the social media age?
I think you're definitely right. The things are changing. Then, of course, the impact of in Japan means that we didn't see many group like this developing. This doesn't mean, as you say, in a sense, social media has created this giant conspiracy theories group and this other type of organization that are equally problematic in some sense, or how people that goes into those. But there is a shift, I think, this idea sometime of, the kind of structure of those group in the 80s and the 90s with the leader. We haven't seen them in Japan. Can they come back? who knows? And they can emerge in different forms that are not necessarily so religiously defined, in my opinion. They might, emerge in a more crossover with politics. In terms of changing your mind, but there is another point that came out quite interested in talking with Japanese colleagues, is that up to a certain generation, people remembered the sarin gas attack. The new generation don't. If I talk about 1995 with my student in class, they weren't born. It's history for them.
Yeah.
And the one in the UK simply don't know. But even the one in Japan, they might have heard about it, but it's so distant for them that even this kind of dangerous negative images about Aum is not there anymore for them. So this is where the thing can become interesting, I think. Not the first 20, 30 years, because it's so close.
Right.
But then when the more we go away or we take a distance, then it will be interesting to see.
So almost,
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, almost like if you don't learn history, you're doomed to repeat it. So they're forgetting it. And maybe that is a cause for another group like to appear.
This was one of the points made by the Victim Association before the executions. The Victim Association actually were not happy for the member to be executed. They want, Azahara was executed with 12 members in July 2018, over 2 days. And the member association the Victim Association were all very in favor of executing Azahara, but not about executing the members. And one of the points where keeping them in prison will be a reminder of what has happened. But if we execute all of them, they will be gone. The memory will be gone. So that was the point that they also made. In practice, looking at the remaining member at the moment, I think, for them as well, I think for a lot of them, think or change, they don't think as they thought in the 90s, of course. But they also, and this is a sad aspect of it, no, they don't have a place to go. And so for some of them, staying in the group is the safest option than ended up in the street. And this, I think, is something to think about when you've been part of those organizations for decades. It's really difficult to leave. Where do you go? You don't have a job. So I think there is also this aspect of if you want reintegration, I don't know how people will call it, that has never been much discussed with former members, that they do not care that much about the teaching anymore. But there is this kind of social networking connection aspect that make them safer to stay in the organization. Immediately after the sarin gas attack, a lot of members left. The lay member dissociated with no problem, but even a lot of members in the commune left. But the one who stayed, after a while, it was a bit too late. It became more and more difficult and going back to the reference to the Japanese society is not really easy to go back and justify in your CV, for example, what have you done in those years?
Right.
You need to put something, and if it's 1 or 2 years, you can say I did an overseas experience, or I looked after a sick relative. But it start being 15 years is more difficult.
So, what's something outside of, like, what else are you interested in or fascinated by outside of Japan and Japanese society and the what else do you find fascinating?
I always find fascinating the stories of the people. So even with Aum, what I find it really interesting was to listening to these people that are in a sense disconnected or feel themselves at the margin. I'm very interested on marginalities and minorities. But I'm really interested usually at the micro level, so at the level of the individual narratives and their emotion, more than necessarily of the big structure. My work is going more and more in that direction of looking at minority marginalities, but also at fear, for example, is another topic I'm very interested in because it's so dominant also in our political and societal discourse. And the last 2 years with the pandemic, it was kind of dominant in a lot of our discourse as how fear is how it's play a role in creating belonging in people and communities is another thing that I'm interested in to explore beyond Japan as well, of course.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you for appearing on the show. Thank you so much. Where can people find you if they have questions about
I'm on Twitter, but also the University of Manchester has my website there. So there is my email address on the website.
Well, Professor Baffelli, I want to thank you for coming on the show. You were an amazing guest. I'm so glad. It took us like a couple months to sort of wrangle this thing together, but you were awesome and you were always welcome back.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Well, everyone, I want to thank you all for joining us for this very special episode of This Uncanny Earth. It will be up now, so you can listen to it whenever you'd like. We'll be back next Friday when we'll be talking about, I don't know what we're going to talk about. I will let you folks know. Anyways, guys, as always, why be boring when you can be uncanny? We will see you folks next week.